The massive council chamber stretched across 300 meters of polished crystal floors and towering columns that seemed to reach into infinity. Brandon Cole stood in the center of the circular platform, surrounded by 7 towering figures representing the most powerful species in the known galaxy. His black diplomatic uniform felt heavier than usual, as thousands of alien eyes watched his every movement through holographic displays that broadcast this moment to billions across council space. The air felt thick and electric with tension that had been building for months. Executor Zalth rose from his seat, his massive Vraxian frame casting shadows across the chamber floor. His voice boomed through translation devices that made his words sound like grinding metal mixed with thunder. The message was simple and brutal in its clarity. Humanity had 72 hours to abandon 15 colony worlds in the Outer Rim territories. 2 million human souls would need to leave their homes, their farms, their cities, everything they had built over 3 generations of hard work and sacrifice. If humanity refused this demand, the Council would take action to remove them by force. Brandon kept his face neutral even though his heart pounded against his ribs. He had been a diplomat for 20 years and had negotiated trade deals, border disputes, and cultural exchanges with dozens of alien species. Nothing in his career had prepared him for this moment. The Council was not asking for negotiation or compromise. They were delivering an ultimatum that left no room for discussion. He opened his mouth to respond, but Zalth raised one massive clawed hand to silence him. The time for talking had passed according to the Council. Humanity would comply or face the consequences. Far beyond the Zentara Prime system, Commander Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the Valiant, watching tactical displays that showed the positioning of his fleet. 300 warships waited in the darkness between stars, their engines cold, their weapon systems powered down to minimal levels to avoid detection. Jake had commanded ships for 2 decades, but had never been given orders like the ones sitting in his encrypted message queue. Admiral Lisa Grant had transmitted them personally with her command codes and biometric verification. The orders gave him complete discretion over fleet actions, something that violated every standard protocol in the military handbook. Jake looked at the faces of his bridge crew and saw the same tension he felt in his own chest. Lieutenant Kelly Andrews monitored communications from her station, her fingers moving across holographic controls with practiced efficiency. She had intercepted the Council's public broadcast of the ultimatum and played it for the senior staff 3 hours ago. The mood on every ship in the fleet had shifted from professional readiness to barely controlled anger. These sailors had friends and family on those colony worlds. Some had been born there themselves before joining the service. On Earth, in the underground Situation Room buried beneath Geneva, President Kevin Walsh sat at the head of a long table, surrounded by his closest advisors. The room had been built to withstand nuclear strikes and electromagnetic pulses. Designed during the paranoid years of the early space age, when humanity first encountered alien life, now it served as the command center for a crisis that dwarfed any previous threat to human civilization. Large screens covered every wall, showing data streams from diplomatic channels, military deployments, and civilian evacuation planning. Defense Secretary Amy Rodriguez slammed her hand on the table hard enough to make the water glasses jump. She had been arguing for immediate military response since the ultimatum arrived. Her position was clear and uncompromising. The Council had no legal right to demand anything from humanity. Earth had claimed those colony worlds through proper exploration and settlement procedures that even the Council's own laws recognized. This was nothing more than a power play designed to test humanity's resolve. If they surrendered these colonies, the Council would just make more demands until humanity was completely subjugated. Rebecca Stone sat across from Amy with a very different expression on her face. The diplomatic liaison had spent 15 years building relationships with Council species, and she believed there was still room for negotiation. She argued that military confrontation with the Council was suicide. They had weapons technology that was thousands of years more advanced than anything humanity possessed. Their fleets numbered in the tens of thousands of ships. They had never lost a major conflict in recorded history. Diplomacy was not weakness. It was humanity's only realistic path to survival. President Walsh listened to both arguments while watching intelligence reports scroll across his personal display. The truth was uglier than either of his advisors wanted to admit. Every human diplomatic channel had gone silent exactly 1 hour ago. Ambassador Cole had sent a brief encrypted message before communications were cut. The Council was not waiting for the deadline to expire. Their enforcement fleets were already moving into position around the human colonies. The ultimatum was just theater, to make their actions seem justified to the broader galactic community. On the lunar base, Lieutenant Nicole Hayes sat in the Deep Space Monitoring Station surrounded by screens showing energy signatures from across the solar system and beyond. She had been tracking unusual readings for the past 6 hours, and the pattern was unmistakable. Massive fleets were moving through jump points at the edge of Council space, all converging on vectors that led directly to human territory. She had reported this to her superiors, who had forwarded the data up the chain of command. The Council was not preparing for a blockade or show of force. They were positioning for a full military assault. Nicole pulled up historical data from the archives and cross-referenced Council fleet movements over the past century. What she found made her blood run cold. These exact patterns had appeared 17 times in recorded history. Each time, they preceded what the Council called enforcement actions. Each time, an entire civilization disappeared from the galactic maps within weeks. The Council did not negotiate with species they deemed problematic. They eliminated them completely and efficiently. Back in the Council chamber, Brandon Cole finally spoke when Zalth permitted him to respond. His words were carefully chosen and delivered with the calm professionalism that had made him one of Earth's top diplomats. He requested additional time to consult with his government. He suggested a compromise where humanity would halt new colony expansion while both sides discussed the territorial concerns. He offered to host a delegation of Council observers on Earth to demonstrate humanity's peaceful intentions. Zalth listened with an expression that might have been amusement on his alien features. When Brandon finished speaking, the executor delivered his response with finality. 72 hours. Not 1 minute more. Humanity would abandon the colonies, or the Council would sterilize those worlds and everyone on them. There would be no negotiation, no compromise, no extension of the deadline. Brandon was dismissed from the chamber. As Brandon walked through the massive doors that sealed behind him with a sound like a tomb closing, he touched the small communication device hidden in his collar. He sent a single coded word that traveled through quantum relays back to Earth. The word was simple. The word changed everything. The word was execute. 3 months before the ultimatum shook the foundations of human civilization, Dr. Daniel Carter sat in a dimly lit laboratory buried 2 kilometers beneath the Martian surface. The ancient artifact rested on a suspension field in the center of the room, humming with energy that defied every known law of physics. Daniel had been studying this object for 16 months since the deep space mining crew discovered it floating in the Kuiper Belt. It was a perfect sphere, measuring exactly 2 meters in diameter, made from a material that was harder than diamond yet lighter than aluminum. Every scientific instrument ever pointed at it had failed to penetrate its surface or determine its age. Doctor, Monica Price walked into the lab carrying 3 cups of coffee and the exhausted expression of someone who had not slept in 48 hours. She set 1 cup in front of Daniel and took a long drink from her own before speaking. She had finally cracked the mathematical sequence hidden in the artifact's energy fluctuations. The patterns were not random noise as everyone had assumed for over a year. They were a message encoded in a base 12 mathematical system that required quantum computational power to decode properly. Daniel felt his hands shake as he pulled up Monica's data on the main display. The message materialized on the screen in translated text that had been converted through 7 layers of linguistic analysis. What they read made both scientists forget about their coffee entirely. The artifact was not just an ancient piece of technology left behind by some long-dead civilization. It was a warning beacon specifically designed to be found by developing species before they made first contact with the Galactic Council. The message told a story that contradicted everything humanity had been told about Council history. The Council presented itself as an ancient alliance of peaceful species who had joined together to maintain order and prosperity across the galaxy. They claimed to have existed for over 50,000 years in various forms, always guided by principles of cooperation and mutual respect. The artifact's message called this a complete lie, built on top of mass graves. According to the beacon, the Council had destroyed 17 civilizations over the past 10,000 years. Each time the pattern was identical. A young species would develop faster than light travel and make contact with Council representatives. Initial relations would be friendly and productive. Trade would flourish, and cultural exchanges would begin. Then the young species would start to grow too quickly, or develop technology that made the Council nervous. The Council would issue demands, disguised as diplomatic requests. When the young species refused or hesitated, the Council would eliminate them entirely. Monica pulled up a secondary file that contained detailed records of each extinction event. The architects had been the civilization that created the warning beacon, and they had documented their own destruction as their final act. They had been master builders who reshaped entire planets and created wonders that made Council technology look primitive by comparison. The Council had demanded they share their construction methods, and when the architects refused, Council fleets had ignited their homeworld's atmosphere. 3 billion souls had burned in less than an hour. The Zephans had been aquatic beings who discovered a method of medical treatment that could extend lifespans indefinitely. The Council had ordered them to surrender this technology exclusively to Council control. When the Zephans instead offered to share it freely with all species, the Council destabilized their ocean world's core. The entire population died when their planet literally tore itself apart. The Council told the galaxy that the Zephans had caused their own destruction through reckless planetary engineering. Daniel felt sick reading through case after case of systematic genocide, disguised as enforcement actions or tragic accidents. The Council maintained galactic peace by eliminating anyone who might challenge their absolute authority. They were not protectors of civilization. They were its greatest predators. Meanwhile, halfway across the solar system, Intelligence Officer Ryan Matthews sat in a crowded bar on Tarsus 4, pretending to be a freelance cargo hauler who drank too much and talked too loudly. He had been working undercover on this Council world for 2 years, slowly building relationships with low-level bureaucrats and military personnel who frequented establishments like this one. The key to good intelligence work was patience and the ability to become invisible by being completely ordinary. Tonight his patience paid off when a Vraxian naval officer named Kelthax sat down at his table after drinking enough fermented nectar to loosen his usually tight military discipline. Ryan bought another round and listened as Kelthax complained about his latest assignment. The officer was part of a logistics team, positioning special weapons platforms around human colony worlds. He did not understand why Command was wasting resources on such a minor species that barely had 300 warships to their name. Ryan kept his expression neutral and asked casual questions about the platforms while pretending to be more interested in his drink. Kelthax explained that these were planet pacification systems, weapons so powerful they could ignite a world's atmosphere or cause tectonic collapse that would tear continents apart. Ryan had heard rumors about such weapons, but confirmation from a military source made his blood run cold. The Council was not preparing for a blockade or military occupation. They were preparing to commit genocide. Over the next week, Ryan confirmed the information through 3 other independent sources. The Council had already decided humanity's fate before issuing any ultimatum. The diplomatic pressure was just theater to make their actions seem justified. Human colonies would be given an impossible choice, and when they refused, the Council would activate those planet-killer weapons. Earth would watch its children die on 15 worlds and then face the same choice itself: surrender or extinction. Captain Ashley Thompson commanded a ship called Shadow that did not officially exist in any military registry. It was a stealth reconnaissance vessel, equipped with sensor baffles and hull coating that made it nearly invisible to standard detection systems. For 6 months, Ashley and her crew had been mapping Council military installations across their core territories. The data they collected painted a picture of overwhelming military superiority. The Council had weapons, ships, and defensive systems that humanity could not match in open warfare. But Ashley's tactical analysis revealed something the Council had forgotten during their 10,000 years of unopposed dominance. They had become predictable. Their weapons technology had barely evolved in millennia because they had never faced an opponent who forced them to innovate. Their defensive systems were optimized against energy weapons and plasma torpedoes because that was what every Council species used. Their tactical doctrines were rigid and formal because they had crushed every opponent so quickly that adaptability was unnecessary. Ashley sent her reports back to Fleet Command with a simple conclusion. Humanity could not win a conventional war against the Council. But humans did not fight conventional wars when their survival was at stake. They adapted, they innovated, and they fought dirty when necessary. If Earth could develop weapons systems the Council had never encountered before, if they could strike at vulnerabilities the Council did not know existed, there might be a chance. General Tyler Kennedy received all these reports in his office at Strategic Command and assembled them into a single horrifying picture. He called an emergency meeting of the Global Defense Council and presented the evidence to humanity's top military and political leaders. The conclusion was unanimous. The Council planned to exterminate humanity regardless of any diplomatic action. Negotiation was a waste of time. Surrender meant death. Humanity's only option was total war, and it had to be decisive enough to neutralize the Council completely. President Walsh authorized a plan so dangerous that it would either save humanity or doom them to extinction faster than the Council had planned. The order went out through encrypted channels to every corner of human space. Project Warhammer was activated. While Ambassador Brandon Cole kept the Council's attention focused on diplomatic theater and endless procedural delays, humanity prepared for war with an intensity and focus that would have terrified the Council if they had been paying attention. Project Warhammer existed in the shadows of classified military installations spread across the solar system, hidden from Council observers, and even from most of Earth's own population. The scale of preparation was staggering, and the timeline was brutally compressed into 60 days of round-the-clock construction, testing, and deployment. Engineer Chris Bailey stood in the command center of the weapons development facility on Titan, watching test results scroll across dozens of displays, while his team of 200 scientists and engineers worked through their third consecutive shift without sleep. Chris had been pulled from a comfortable position designing commercial spacecraft engines and told that he had 8 weeks to revolutionize human weapons technology. The challenge seemed impossible until he understood the fundamental insight that would change everything. Humanity did not need to match Council technology. They needed to make the Council's technology irrelevant. The Council's military doctrine had remained unchanged for thousands of years because it worked perfectly against every opponent they had ever faced. Their ships carried energy shields calibrated to deflect plasma weapons and high-energy lasers. Their armor plating was designed to ablate and disperse heat from directed energy attacks. Their point defense systems tracked fast-moving missiles and destroyed them with precision laser batteries. Every aspect of their defensive systems assumed opponents would fight using Council-approved technology. Chris and his team threw out every assumption about proper military engineering and started from basic physics. Instead of energy weapons that the Council could shield against, they designed kinetic railguns that accelerated solid metal projectiles to relativistic speeds using electromagnetic coils that stretched the entire length of a ship's hull. These projectiles would hit with the force of tactical nuclear weapons, but carried no energy signature that shields were designed to deflect. The physics were simple and brutal. A slug of tungsten traveling at 30% of light speed would punch through Council armor like it was tissue paper. The quantum disruption missiles were Monica Price's contribution based on her research into the ancient artifact. She discovered that Council shields operated by creating a quantum field that deflected incoming energy by shifting it into adjacent dimensional spaces. The math was elegant, but it had a fatal flaw. If you could destabilize the quantum coherence of the shield itself, the entire defensive system would collapse. Her missiles did not explode on impact. They phased through shields and armor, using the same dimensional shifting technology, then detonated inside the target ship's reactor core. The biological nanite swarms were the most controversial weapon system and had sparked heated debates in the Ethics Committee until President Walsh himself authorized their development. These microscopic machines were programmed to recognize Council ship hull materials and power systems. Once deployed, they would spread across a target vessel like a plague, consuming structural materials and disrupting electrical systems. Within minutes, they could reduce a warship to a floating hulk. The Council had never encountered nanotechnology warfare because they considered it beneath civilized species. Humanity had no such qualms when facing extinction. Commander Laura Griffin oversaw the secret construction yards hidden deep in the asteroid belt, where 30 new warships were being assembled using techniques that would have been impossible just 5 years earlier. These Reaper-class destroyers incorporated every weakness that Ryan Matthews had identified in Council defensive systems. They were smaller and faster than traditional capital ships, designed to swarm larger opponents and overwhelm them with concentrated firepower. Their hulls were covered in sensor-absorbent materials that made them difficult to target. Their reactor systems could be overloaded deliberately to create devastating explosions if the ship was disabled, ensuring that Council forces could not capture human technology intact. Laura watched as the final Reaper-class ship rolled out of Construction Bay 17. It had taken 60,000 workers laboring in round-the-clock shifts to complete this impossible task. The ships were not pretty or elegant like Council vessels. They were blunt instruments of war, designed for a single purpose. Every system had been optimized for maximum damage output with minimal crew requirements. A traditional destroyer carried a crew of 400. The Reapers operated with just 80 personnel and heavy automation. This meant humanity could field more ships with the limited trained crews available. On Europa Station, Dr. Matt Harrison directed the most sobering project of all. The Genesis Protocol was humanity's backup plan if the war went badly. 100 sleeper ships were being loaded with genetic material from every species of Earth life, from humans to bacteria. Each ship carried embryos in cryogenic storage, artificial wombs that could gestate them, and advanced artificial intelligence systems programmed with humanity's entire cultural and scientific knowledge. If Earth fell, these ships would scatter to distant galaxies beyond Council reach. Matt hated everything about this project because it represented giving up. It meant accepting that humanity might lose everything. But he also understood the necessity. Extinction was permanent. If humanity lost this war, the Council would erase every trace of their existence. The sleeper ships would ensure that somewhere in the vast universe, human children would be born and grow up and rebuild what was lost. It was cold comfort, but it was better than nothing. Admiral Lisa Grant assembled her fleet in secret staging areas scattered across the outer solar system. 400 warships represented every combat-capable vessel humanity could muster. Traditional carriers designed to launch fighter squadrons, heavy cruisers mounting the new railgun batteries, destroyers equipped with quantum missiles, support ships carrying the nanite swarm dispensers, and at the heart of the fleet, the 30 Reaper class vessels that would lead the attack. Lisa had commanded fleets in training exercises and minor skirmishes with pirates, but nothing had prepared her for the weight of responsibility she felt now. Every captain in this fleet understood the stakes. Every crew member had volunteered knowing they might not survive the coming battle. The orders she carried were clear and left no room for mercy or hesitation. When the attack began, there would be no warning shots or demands for surrender. Humanity would strike with everything they had and destroy the Council's ability to wage war. The tactical plan was built around surprise and overwhelming violence. Traditional military doctrine called for careful engagement at range, with gradual escalation of force. Lisa's orders threw out the rulebook completely. The fleet would use experimental jump technology, reverse-engineered from the artifact to appear directly in orbit around Council homeworlds. Bypassing every defensive perimeter, they would achieve total surprise and press that advantage ruthlessly. Every ship carried specific targeting packages based on the intelligence that Ryan Matthews had gathered. Primary targets were the Council's command and control systems. Secondary targets were shipyards and manufacturing facilities. Tertiary targets were the planet-killer weapons positioned around human colonies. The goal was not to conquer Council territory or occupy their worlds. The goal was to shatter their military capability so completely that they could never threaten humanity again. Training exercises ran constantly, as crews practiced the new tactics over and over until they could execute them perfectly while exhausted or injured. Fighter pilots learned to exploit the weaknesses in Council Point defense systems. Gunners practiced targeting solutions for the railguns against moving targets. Damage control teams prepared for the brutal casualties that were inevitable when facing an opponent with superior numbers. Every person in the fleet understood that victory would come at a terrible price. On Earth, production facilities ran at maximum capacity, manufacturing ammunition, spare parts, medical supplies, and everything else a fleet would need for sustained combat operations. Civilian volunteers worked alongside military personnel in an effort that united humanity like nothing before. The Council had made the fatal mistake of threatening human children. They had triggered an instinct that ran deeper than reason or caution. Humanity would fight with the desperate fury of parents protecting their young. President Walsh visited the fleet assembly points personally to address the crews. His message was simple. The Council had decided humanity's fate without giving them a voice or a choice. Now humanity would deliver their answer. Not with words or diplomacy, but with actions that would echo across the galaxy. The age of the Council was ending, and humanity would be the ones to end it. Every sailor who heard that speech felt something shift inside them. Fear turned to determination. Uncertainty became resolve. As the deadline approached, and Ambassador Cole played his part on Zentara Prime, the pieces moved into position for the largest military operation in human history. The Council believed they were facing a primitive species that would either surrender or be crushed. They were about to discover that humanity's greatest strength was not their technology or their numbers. It was their absolute refusal to accept extinction without making their enemies pay dearly for it. The Galactic Council chambers erupted in chaos, as proximity alarms screamed warnings that should have been impossible. Executor Zalth's massive form rose from his seat as tactical displays materialized, showing a nightmare scenario that violated every principle of defensive warfare. 300 human warships had appeared simultaneously in orbit around Zentara Prime without any warning or gradual approach. They had simply materialized out of nowhere, bypassing defensive perimeters that were supposed to detect incoming vessels from light years away. The jump technology that made this possible had been reverse-engineered from the ancient artifact by a team of physicists who had worked themselves to exhaustion for 2 months. Traditional faster-than-light travel required ships to drop out of jump space at the edge of a star system and then travel through normal space to reach their destination. This gave defenders hours or even days of warning. The human ships used quantum entanglement to create temporary wormholes that connected 2 points in space directly. The energy requirements were enormous, and the calculations required split-second precision. But the result was total strategic surprise. Commander Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the Valiant and watched as his tactical officer confirmed that all 300 ships had arrived intact and in formation. The jump had been the riskiest part of the entire operation. If the calculations were wrong, ships could have materialized inside planets or scattered across light years of space. But the math had been perfect, and now the entire human fleet floated in a perfect sphere around the Council's capital world, with weapons armed and shields at maximum. Executor Zalth activated the emergency channel to the human fleet, and his voice thundered across every ship's communication system. He demanded an explanation for this unprecedented violation of Council space and diplomatic protocol. His tone carried the absolute certainty of someone who had never been challenged in his entire life. The Council's home fleet was scrambling to respond, but they were caught completely out of position with their best ships scattered across Council territory. Ambassador Brandon Cole appeared on the main display in the Council chamber with an expression that was no longer diplomatic or conciliatory. His words were broadcast across every Council world simultaneously, through communication satellites that human operatives had been subtly compromising for months. The speech he delivered had been written by President Walsh himself, and every word carried the weight of humanity's collective fury. Humanity had been given an ultimatum to abandon their colonies or face extermination. The Council had positioned planet-killer weapons around human worlds and prepared to commit genocide. They had done this 17 times before to other civilizations who refused to submit to Council authority. But humanity had discovered the truth about the Council's bloody history. They had learned about the architects and the Zephins and all the other species who had been erased from existence. Now, humanity had come to deliver their response to the Council's ultimatum. The response was simple. The Council was dissolved, effective immediately. Every species under Council authority would be granted true autonomy. The Council's weapons of mass destruction would be dismantled. Any attempt to resist these terms would result in humanity demonstrating exactly what total destruction actually meant. Brandon's final words were delivered with quiet intensity. Humanity had not come to negotiate. They had come to dictate terms to tyrants who thought themselves untouchable. Captain Ashley Thompson's stealth ships had been positioned inside Council space for weeks before the main fleet arrived. While everyone focused on the dramatic appearance of 300 warships, her teams were executing the second phase of the operation. Every Council command ship in the home fleet suddenly found their weapon systems offline. Targeting computers filled with garbage data. Communication networks were flooded with human battle coordinates and false orders. The Council's vaunted military superiority meant nothing when their ships could not coordinate or even fire their weapons. The preparation for this moment had been meticulous. Ryan Matthews had identified the specific communication protocols and security systems the Council used. Human programmers had created viruses and intrusion software specifically designed to exploit those systems. Ashley's crews had physically infiltrated key facilities and installed hardware backdoors that now activated on command. The Council had ruled through technological superiority for thousands of years, never imagining that someone might turn that technology against them. Lieutenant Nicole Hayes sent the activation signal from her position on the lunar base, a single encrypted burst that traveled through quantum relays to every corner of Council space. Sleeper cells that had been positioned over months began their coordinated strikes. Human operatives and sympathetic aliens who had suffered under Council tyranny struck at supply depots, shipyards, manufacturing facilities, and communication hubs. Explosions blossomed across 7 Council home worlds as critical infrastructure failed. The Council had maintained order through overwhelming force projection, but their actual defensive depth was surprisingly shallow. They had never needed extensive planetary defenses because no one had ever attacked Council worlds directly. Now they discovered that their home worlds were vulnerable in ways they had never considered. Planetary defense grids went offline as control systems were corrupted. Ground-based weapon emplacements found their targeting systems locked out by human cyber warfare specialists. Admiral Lisa Grant gave the order that would define humanity's place in galactic history. 300 ships opened fire simultaneously, with weapons the Council had never encountered. Railgun rounds accelerated to relativistic speeds and crossed the distance to Council ships in fractions of a second. The kinetic projectiles hit with devastating force, punching through shields that were designed to deflect energy weapons. Council ships that had survived centuries of service died in explosions that lit up the space around Zentara Prime. Quantum disruption missiles phased through defensive systems like they did not exist. Council point defense lasers tracked them and fired, but the missiles simply shifted into adjacent dimensional spaces and reappeared inside the target vessels. Reactor cores destabilized and exploded, tearing ships apart from within. Council captains who had decades of combat experience had no frame of reference for weapons that ignored their defenses completely. The nanite swarms were released in waves that looked like dark clouds spreading through space. When they contacted Council ship hulls, they began consuming the molecular structure of the armor, plating, and spreading like a metallic plague. Ship systems failed as the nanites disrupted power conduits and electrical systems. Within minutes, proud warships that had flown for generations became dead hulks floating in orbit. The Council's enforcement fleet had been the largest military force ever assembled in galactic history. Over 2,000 warships, equipped with weapons capable of destroying planets. Now that fleet found itself fighting an opponent that refused to play by established rules of warfare. Council tactics assumed enemies would engage at range with energy weapons. Human ships closed to point-blank range and fired kinetic rounds that shredded targets before shields could adapt. Council formations assumed enemies would respect standard engagement protocols. Human squadrons swarmed individual targets with overwhelming local superiority. The battle lasted 4 hours of sustained combat that was more slaughter than fight. Council ships tried to adapt and respond, but they were fighting with systems designed for a different kind of war. Their weapons could devastate human ships when they connected, but human vessels were smaller and faster and harder to target. The railguns fired from ranges where Council plasma weapons lost coherence. The quantum missiles could not be stopped by any defensive system the Council possessed. When the firing finally stopped, the Council's enforcement fleet had ceased to exist as a functional military force. Debris fields marked where proud warships had died. Hundreds of disabled vessels drifted in orbit with their systems corrupted by nanite infiltration. Council casualties numbered in the hundreds of thousands, while human losses were measured in dozens of ships and thousands of crew. The exchange ratio was brutally one-sided. 7 Council homeworlds now had human warships in their skies, with weapons pointed at population centers. The planet-killer weapons that had been positioned around human colonies were now in human hands, their Council operators dead or captured. The balance of power in the galaxy had shifted in 4 hours of combat that rewrote every assumption about military superiority. Executor Zalth stood in the Council chambers, staring at tactical displays that showed the complete destruction of Council military power. His species had dominated galactic politics for 8,000 years. They had crushed 17 civilizations that dared to resist. Now, they faced an enemy that had not just defeated them but humiliated them. The Council had prepared to exterminate humanity. Instead, humanity had arrived and brought total destruction to everything the Council represented. Commander Jake Morrison received new orders from Admiral Grant. Human forces would occupy Council military facilities and begin the process of dismantling weapons of mass destruction. Any resistance would be met with immediate overwhelming force. The time for mercy or half measures had passed. Humanity had committed to this course of action, and they would see it through to the end, regardless of cost. The galaxy watched in stunned silence as news of the battle spread through faster-than-light communication networks. Species that had lived under Council authority for millennia could barely comprehend what they were witnessing. The seemingly invincible Council had been shattered by a species that most had dismissed as primitive newcomers. The age of Council dominance was over, and something new was beginning. President Kevin Walsh stood on the bridge of the Valiant, in orbit above Zentara Prime, and addressed what remained of the Galactic Council through every communication channel in known space. His message was being broadcast to billions of beings across thousands of worlds, and the weight of that responsibility showed in every carefully chosen word. The Council that had ruled through fear and systematic extermination for 10,000 years was dissolved effective immediately. Every species would be granted complete autonomy to govern themselves without interference from any central authority. The age of forced submission was over. The Council members who remained alive sat in their chambers in a state of shock that bordered on catatonic. Executor Zalth's massive frame seemed diminished as he listened to a human leader dictate terms to civilizations that had existed for millennia before Earth even developed written language. The reversal was so complete and so sudden that many Council representatives simply could not process what had happened. Their fleets were destroyed. Their weapons were captured. Their authority was shattered beyond any hope of recovery. Defense Secretary Amy Rodriguez appeared on screens across the galaxy, presenting evidence that made viewers recoil in horror. The complete records from the ancient artifact were broadcast in full detail. 17 previous civilizations that the Council had systematically exterminated. The architects who had been burned alive when their atmosphere was ignited. The Zephans, whose planet had been torn apart from within. Species after species who had committed no crime except refusing to surrender their freedom to Council authority. The evidence included video recordings, sensor logs, and communication intercepts that the architects had managed to preserve in their final hours. The galaxy watched Council warships ignite planetary atmospheres while billions screamed. They saw worlds crack open as tectonic weapons destabilized planetary cores. They heard Council leaders calmly discussing genocide as if it were routine administrative action. The myth of the benevolent council protecting galactic civilization died in the face of undeniable proof of their systematic atrocities. Species across council space who thought they were alone in the universe discovered that their neighboring civilizations had not simply disappeared or destroyed themselves. The council had murdered them and then lied about it for thousands of years. The Kelthani had been told their neighbors. The Sephron died in a civil war. The truth was, the council had exterminated them for developing faster-than-light communication that threatened council control of information. The Traxians believed the nearby Kolenthi system was abandoned due to plague. The reality was the council had sterilized their worlds for refusing to surrender mineral rights. Outrage spread like wildfire through populations that had been lied to for generations. On Tarsus 4, riots broke out as citizens demanded answers from their government about what else they had been told that was false. On Vraxia Prime, military officers who had served the council with pride discovered they had been enforcers for genocidal tyrants. Entire planetary governments collapsed as the full scope of council crimes became undeniable. Dr. Daniel Carter and Dr. Monica Price presented the complete contents of the ancient artifact to scientific communities across the galaxy. The architects had been master builders and engineers, whose technology made current council capabilities look primitive. They had offered to share their knowledge freely with all species. The council had demanded exclusive control, and when refused, they had committed genocide. The message was clear to every species watching. Innovation and progress were threats to council power. The artifact also contained detailed schematics for the dimensional jump technology that humanity had used to achieve total surprise in their attack. Monica explained that the architects had meant for this technology to be shared with any species capable of understanding it. They had designed the beacon specifically to give future civilizations the tools they would need to resist council tyranny. Humanity had been the first species in 10,000 years to find the beacon and successfully decode its message. Commander Jake Morrison oversaw the dismantling of planet-killer weapons, with teams of engineers who worked carefully to deactivate systems that could have destroyed worlds. Each weapon was disabled in full view of the populations it had threatened. Human ships broadcast live video feeds as these instruments of genocide were torn apart and their components scattered into the nearest star. The psychological impact was profound. Species that had lived under the implicit threat of these weapons for generations watched them destroyed and felt something they had not experienced in millennia: hope. The process of dismantling took weeks as teams worked their way through hundreds of weapons platforms positioned across council space. Some council military personnel attempted to resist the destruction, claiming the weapons were necessary for galactic security. Jake had his orders, and they were crystal clear. Any resistance was met with immediate overwhelming force. 3 council ships that tried to protect a weapon platform were disabled, and their crews arrested. The message was unmistakable. This was not a negotiation. General Tyler Kennedy stood before representatives from over 300 species and presented the framework for a new galactic assembly. Unlike the old council that had concentrated power in 7 species, the new assembly would grant equal representation to every civilization regardless of size or military strength. Decisions would require broad consensus rather than being dictated by the strongest members. Economic development, scientific research, and cultural exchange would be encouraged rather than controlled. The proposal met resistance from species that had benefited from council authority and feared losing their privileged positions. The Vraxian delegation argued that smaller species lacked the wisdom to govern themselves and needed guidance from more advanced civilizations. Kennedy's response was delivered with the cold precision of someone who had spent months preparing for this moment. The Council's version of guidance had resulted in 17 genocides. Humanity would ensure that never happened again, even if it meant maintaining a military presence indefinitely. The human fleet would remain active and deployed across former Council space, not as conquerors, but as protectors, against any species that attempted to resurrect the old system. Kennedy made it clear that humanity had no interest in building an empire or controlling other civilizations. They simply wanted to ensure that no species ever again faced the choice between submission and extinction. Any attempt to threaten independent worlds or force them into compliance would be met with the same overwhelming response the Council had experienced. Some species embraced the new order enthusiastically, particularly those who had been marginalized under Council authority. The Pelthani had been classified as a minor species and denied access to advanced technologies. Now they sent delegates to the assembly with excitement about finally having a voice. The Garanthi had been forced to surrender mining rights to their own asteroid belts. Now they reclaimed control of their resources and began planning independent development. Other species struggled with the transition from the rigid hierarchy they had known for thousands of years. The Kelthani had held a privileged position on the Council and benefited from preferential trade agreements. Now they faced competition from species they had previously dominated. Their delegation attempted to negotiate special status based on their advanced technology. The Assembly rejected this unanimously. The age of special privileges based on military strength was over. Ambassador Brandon Cole represented humanity at the first formal session of the Galactic Assembly 6 months after the battle that had shattered the old order. The Assembly Hall was designed to accommodate representatives from hundreds of species with different atmospheric and gravitational requirements. Holographic displays allowed those who could not physically attend to participate remotely. The diversity was staggering and beautiful in a way the old council chambers had never been. Brandon's speech to the assembly became one of the defining moments in galactic history. He acknowledged that humanity had arrived as destroyers, bringing violence and upheaval that had cost hundreds of thousands of lives. He did not apologize for this, because the alternative had been humanity's extinction. But he emphasized that destruction had not been humanity's goal. Their goal was freedom, both for themselves and for every species that had suffered under council tyranny. The council had given humanity a choice between surrender and annihilation. Humanity had chosen neither. Instead, they had chosen to fight for the right to exist on their own terms, and to extend that right to every civilization in the galaxy. The weapons humanity had developed were devastating, but they had been created only because the Council left no other option. Now those weapons would serve a different purpose. They would protect the weak from the strong, and ensure that no species could ever again rule through fear. Brandon concluded with words that echoed across assembly chambers and were repeated in hundreds of languages across thousands of worlds. This was humanity's gift to the galaxy. Not conquest or domination, but the opportunity for true civilization to emerge. A civilization based on cooperation rather than coercion. A civilization where innovation was celebrated rather than suppressed. A civilization where every species had the freedom to chart their own destiny without fear of extinction. The Assembly voted to accept the new charter with overwhelming support. The transition would not be easy or quick. Thousands of years of council authority had created dependencies and power structures that could not be dismantled overnight. There would be conflicts and challenges and setbacks, but the fundamental principle had been established. No species had the right to dictate terms to another. No civilization had authority to extinguish another for refusing to submit. Admiral Lisa Grant addressed her fleet one final time before beginning the long process of demobilization. The war had been won, but the peace would require different skills and different approaches. Some ships would remain on patrol to enforce assembly decisions and respond to threats. Others would return home to Earth, where populations were eager to welcome back their defenders. The victory had come at a cost, measured in thousands of lives and ships that would never return. But they had achieved something worth that sacrifice. On Earth, celebrations mixed with mourning as the reality of what had been accomplished sank in. Humanity had faced the most powerful military force in galactic history and emerged victorious. They had shattered an empire that had ruled unopposed for 10,000 years. They had freed hundreds of species from tyranny and established a new order based on principles of equality and freedom. The cost had been high, but the alternative had been extinction. Captain Ashley Thompson stood on the observation deck of the Shadow and watched as the last planet-killer weapon was destroyed in the fires of a nearby star. Her ship had played a crucial role in humanity's victory through months of dangerous reconnaissance and cyber warfare operations. Now her mission was changing from gathering intelligence on enemies to building relationships with allies. The skills required would be different, but the stakes remained high. Dr. Matt Harrison shut down the Genesis protocol systems on Europa Station with profound relief. The sleeper ships that were meant to preserve humanity after extinction would not be needed. Instead, they would be repurposed for exploration and colonization of distant regions, where humans could build new worlds without threatening established civilizations. The backup plan for humanity's survival had become an opportunity for expansion and growth. Lieutenant Nicole Hayes monitored communication networks that now buzzed with traffic from hundreds of species engaging in unrestricted dialogue for the first time in millennia. Scientific papers were being shared across civilizations. Cultural exchanges were being organized. Trade agreements were being negotiated between species that had barely been allowed to communicate under council rules. The galaxy was discovering what freedom actually meant, and the results were chaotic and beautiful. The age of the Council had ended not with gradual decline but with sudden catastrophic defeat. The age of true galactic civilization had begun, born from the ashes of humanity's total destruction of tyranny itself. Species across the galaxy looked to the future with uncertainty, but also with hope. They had seen what was possible when someone refused to accept oppression as inevitable. They had witnessed a young species stand against impossible odds and emerge victorious. The lesson was clear. Freedom was worth fighting for, and tyrants were not as invincible as they pretended to be. Humanity had arrived for total destruction, as the Council feared. But what they destroyed was not civilizations or worlds. What they destroyed was the very concept that any species had the right to rule others through fear. That idea was dead, and humanity would ensure it stayed dead for as long as necessary. The galaxy would never be the same,